So thanks for being here. I wanted
Hi, Joe.
to thank Dr. Zahidi for participating in our grand rounds. Dr. Zahidi is a good friend of mine, actually, and he is a forensic psychiatrist. He trained at UConn and then did his fellowship at UCLA, and has been working in the correctional system and doing private forensic work for some time. So we're very privileged to have him today. So thank you, Dr. Zahidi. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Um, Thank you, Dr. Podolsky. As Dr. I don't know how many of you guys know, but Joe Podolsky is also forensically boarded like I am. So I feel like we have a special bond in that sense. Normally, I'm used to giving this lecture. I don't know how you guys do with your grand rounds, but the lectures that I like to give are rather interactive. I'm a little bit new to this Zoom system, so I don't know how to get people to ask me questions. But if we could somehow, some way make it interactive, I would welcome that. Now, Ms. Darcy, if you could help me with that, I would love it. I really only have 5 slides to go over, and I've broken it down into the statistics of correctional psychiatric diagnoses, the history. That's probably my favorite part. What I do at this point, the landmark cases, and some of the logistics, and then I'll leave plenty of room for questions if there are any. For starters, my name is Sorab. I'm currently a psychiatrist for Centurion Healthcare. I am stationed at a very small and remote location up in northeast Pennsylvania, but I do live in Connecticut. I have a small private practice right here in Farmington called the Tangerine Project. And one of my favorite things to do is to lecture in forensics at the UConn Department of Psychiatry. Now, the story of correctional psychiatry, believe it or not, is actually the story of all of psychiatry. What do I mean by that? Let me just go to the next slide. Um, Before we move forward, I think we need to understand how is it that the law regulates what we do. Well, Dr. Zahidi, what does this have anything to do with correctional psychiatry? Well, the law dictates most of what we do in a correctional setting, but it extends beyond that as well. What do you mean by that? Well, when it comes to psychiatric conditions, now I understand that Root is very much focused on bread and butter psychiatry as well as substance abuse. But when it comes to commitments, detaining individuals against their will, um, incarcerating individuals that we have found guilty of a specific crime, how do we get here? How do we get here, and how is it that the law determines what's what? Now, I don't know how old the audience is, but for those of you who were around when OJ got accused of the murder of Nicole Simpson, if you don't know the case, famous football player, it was pretty clear that he was the guy at the time of the scene who murdered his wife. However, he had a fantastic legal team, and they somehow, some way managed to convince the jury that OJ, or at least the prosecution, could not show that OJ had committed the crime. Well, how could that be when everybody knows that OJ did it? The way they did it is they looked at the law in the United States, for better or for worse. The way the law is actually set up is that if you're going to take away somebody's civil liberties, if you're going to contain them, or give them the capital punishment, we would rather let 10 guilty people go free than to incarcerate one innocent person. What does that have to do with standards, Dr. Zahidi? Well, that's how OJ got off. They couldn't show, the prosecution could not show um, beyond a reasonable doubt, which I don't know if there are any attorneys in the audience, but the lawyers hate to put numbers on this. Beyond a reasonable doubt, in my mind, means 90 to 95% sure that somebody has committed a crime. Now, if I get into a fender bender with Dr. Joe Podolsky, does society really care that him and I have a dispute? That, you know what, I'm suing him for X amount of money. Not really. Society doesn't, there, no liberty issue is at stake for let's say it's not a fender bender. Let's say I get sued as a psychiatrist and as a physician for malpractice. Let's say I veered from the standard of care and there was an adverse outcome. Would beyond a reasonable doubt be a reasonable standard? Would the plaintiff have to show beyond 95% that Zahidi committed some kind of malpractice, infraction, what have you? The answer is no. The standard for me to be sued is preponderance of the evidence. And what does that mean in terms of numbers? That means 51% to 49%. That one side, it is more likely than not that Zahidi committed malpractice, or it is more likely than not that Zahidi was driving recklessly and crashed into Podolsky. Now, there's also a third standard. Now, this is the standard that comes in whenever we basically write a PEC. Whenever we send a patient to the hospital, that's a big curtailment of civil liberties. If you think about it, a patient is being detained, not having committed any crimes, and we're detaining them in the emergency room by writing a PEC. And what does that entail? That the person is mentally ill, or there's a mental derangement, and they're either danger to self or to others, or they're gravely disabled. Now, if this is news to anybody, then raise your hand, because we may need to take a step back and discuss that a little bit further. But what is that standard for us to commit somebody to a hospital for psychiatric disease? Now, this is where the case law comes in. Well, Dr. Zahidi, what do you mean by case law? Case law are court decisions that basically prove the standard for all of society. And I will delve into further details. Exhibit A, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, the Supreme Court recently reversed one of its own decisions. Big decision, the Dobbs decision, which was a reversal of Roe v. Wade. It has done that. It has done that. And because the Supreme Court reversed itself, that decision has gone to the states and is no longer federal law that applies to all of the states across the United States. I know I may be getting into the weeds of the legal issue. Please ask me questions. I will pause to see what you guys have to ask. But I'm hoping to tie it all together as we go further into this. And I will repeat some of these concepts. And the last legal concept that I want to start with is the Eighth Amendment. Well, what is the Eighth Amendment? Just like the other amendments, the Founding Fathers had an interest. Having known what the British had done in the 16th and the 17th century, especially when it came to prisoners of war, they had an interest to guarantee against that. In that they understood that there will be moments where punishment will be handed down. But their interest was to make sure that that punishment is proportional, that it is not, in their words, either cruel or if it's not unusual. And that's the main guarantee that every inmate across the United States has, whether they're in a federal system or whether they're in the prison system for every state. Let me pause right there and ask if anybody has any questions. All right, and then I'm just going to proceed. Now,
yeah, Dr. Zahidi, I just have one point of clarification.
Sure.
So a lot of times we have patients that come to our clinic that we think, may be struggling with mental illness. And we're wondering what the legal standard is to get them either to a hospital, and then what the legal standard might be for them to be committed against their will. So if you could just kind of review that high level. I know the answer to it, but
no, I know that's actually an excellent question, and you segue well into this. Before I get into the stats, let me ask you this. I presume it's common knowledge that whenever you want to send a patient in your clinic to the emergency room, there is one evidence of mental illness, that somebody has concerns. Usually the patient is psychotic. The other element for somebody to be sent to the emergency room is, in your opinion or in the staff's opinion, does this person pose a substantial risk of harm to themselves or to other people, or are they gravely disabled? I hope some of this makes sense to the staff. Now, my question is, how did we get here? How did it become dangerousness and grave disability. How did those two criteria become the sole criteria where we could hold somebody against their will in an emergency room for an evaluation and possibly hospitalize them? Because again, I'd like to take a step back. That's a huge curtailment of somebody's civil liberties. Who am I, who is trained as a psychiatrist, to say that you, Mr. Patient, pose a risk of harm to yourself? I do believe that you suffer from psychiatric disease and that I have the power to detain you. If I take a step back, that's a huge amount of power to have over another person. And when you look at it through the lens of the law, it's quite a bit of curtailment of liberties if you really think about it. So having said that, how did things come to be mental illness plus dangerousness or grave disability? It wasn't always like this. Now for this, we got to go back about 100 years. About 100 years. The first psychiatric medication that was discovered was in 1955, and it was Thorazine. Before that, we had nothing. We had nothing. And when it comes to severe mental illness, now terms matter. The terms matter in this sense. What are we talking about when we say severe mental illness? Severe. I'm not talking about somebody who has a specific anxiety who fears spiders. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about SMI as we know it. These include the psychotic conditions, major depressive disorder, usually severe with psychosis. There is bipolar disorder, and some institutions include PTSD, others include complex autism as well. All I'm talking about is 1 to 5% of the population. This percentage has existed throughout history, and we all know that, you know what, this is the percentage that usually doesn't get, there may be something wrong, that they may need treatment. So what do we do about this population? Going back to 100 years ago. Before Thorazine, we had absolutely no answers. So what did we do? For a while, it was the responsibility of the family to look over some family member who suffered from psychiatric disease. Then, most psychiatric residents can speak about this. Around late 19th century, early 20th century, a concept came to the surface. It was called moral therapy or moral treatment. And the principle was, when it comes to people with psychiatric issues, and we were understanding that, you know what, some of these may be suffering from diseases, that they're not just possessed by the demons. If you build a hospital where things are quiet, where things are calm, where they can spend their days in quiet and in contemplation. And what was really interesting is that most of these large houses that were built were very, very, very far away from the urban centers, which I find very fascinating. They built these asylums and basically started admitting these patients that society didn't know what to do with. These asylums, within a few years, became severely overcrowded. France was the first nation to establish an asylum, and at one point, 1% of the entire French population was housed in several asylums. 1%. So that's a huge increase in the population. But Dr. Zahidi, what does this have to do with correctional psychiatry? Fast forward to the 1950s, a little bit of historical review. That's when we had the civil rights movement. That's when trust of the government was very much limited. And it was a perfect storm that we discovered Thorazine at the same time. What did we end up doing? We ended up emptying the asylums. We started emptying the asylums and thinking that we've discovered Thorazine, therefore we have answers for every psychiatric disease there is. What happened to these patients that left the asylums? Where did they end up going? Did they become company CEOs? Not really. Now let's look at the data, and I think we can all come to the conclusion as to what happened with deinstitutionalization. 1950s, the United States had about 350,000 beds for the psychiatrically ill. Today, I believe the data are from 2010, you divide that number by a factor of 10, which is also, I find fascinating, because the Advocacy Treatment Center in Washington, D.C. did a survey in 2014, and the impression is that at this stage, during the modern era. For any one patient who's in a psychiatric hospital anywhere in the United States, you have 10 of them in the prison system, which I find fascinating. We've reduced the factor by 10. The people in the prison system with psychiatric issues have increased by 10. Nowadays, in the prison system, the estimates are 15% suffer from severe psychiatric issues. These are usually based on self-reports, so you can take that with a grain of salt. But the take-home message is, in prison, we have more people with severe mental illness than you have in the greater society. Why is it that they're accumulating in the prison system? Put that question on the shelf. 2018. Now this is where it becomes good for people who practice or are practitioners of the mental health arts. In 2018, over 50% of U.S. counties did not have a psychiatrist. So what does that tell you when it comes to the psychiatric care of inmates who are in prison? That's almost like a double stigma. Forget about the fact that you have a psychiatric issue, but now you're also incarcerated as well. 10 to 30%, now this is when we add the anxiety disorders as well, the percentage goes up to 30% of inmates in prison who are suffering from psychiatric issues. SMI about 15%. When you add the anxiety disorders and the milder issues, you move it up to 30%. And again, these are estimates. Substance abuse rates have gone through the roof in the prison system. And it sort of makes sense because we emptied the asylums. We made it more stringent when it came to punishment for substance-related charges. The mentally ill are more prone to misusing substances. And guess what? They misuse substances, dysfunction worsens, they end up getting incarcerated because they violate laws. Now, I don't want to get into controversy too much, but in 2016, estimates were that 55% of state prisoners were serving sentences for violent offenses. Is there a correlation between severe mental illness and violence? I personally think there's a little bit of overlap. Now, I mentioned that, compared to the 1950s, the number of beds that are available for psychiatric patients has been reduced by a number of 10. Corollary to that, the number of inmates with psychiatric issues, there are 10 of them in the prison system for everyone in society. In the late 20th century, what we did do is that we also increased incarceration by a substantial portion. Evidence for this, 1970, we had 200,000 prison beds. 2020, 50 years later, that number had ballooned to 1.6 million. At this point, 1 out of every 100 men, American men, is incarcerated. Now, this is a picture that I took off the internet because I think it captures very well the story that I'm telling you guys. This is the former Farview State Hospital. It's a gigantic asylum that was erected around 1910, specifically for the criminally insane. Again, it's in Pennsylvania. You walk through the halls, you can feel the spirit of the ages. It's Victorian. It's up on a hill, and it's quite majestic, even a little bit Gothic. Now, what's interesting is that sadly, and this is another picture of Farview State Hospital in Northeast Pennsylvania, and this is where I practice currently. Well, Dr. Zahidi, if this is a state asylum, what business do you have working in a state hospital if you're a correctional psychiatrist? And what's fascinating about Farview State Hospital is that the abuses that took place at this facility, forget about the fact that once it was erected, it became overcrowded in no time. In no time. The abuses that took place in this facility led to the Department of Corrections taking over in a hybrid model from the Department of Health. And the facility basically became a correctional facility that housed people with psychiatric issues that had committed crimes. Now, there's also general population. It's a huge facility, but what used to be a state hospital eventually became a state correctional facility where we cater to the treatment of people who have committed crimes and are mentally ill. Now, this is probably the most important slide that I have to share with you guys. And I think it reflects very nicely on how is it and what is it that we do in terms of psychiatric practice. Like I said, the 1950s were emptying the asylums. What is American society's mood? Huge mistrust of government, huge emphasis of individual liberty. We emptied the asylums, and up to the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, inmates subject to harsh treatment in prison would try to sue. They would try to sue, claiming violation of their constitutional rights. But up to the 1960s, no court was willing to meddle into the administrative and the ongoings of a prison system. Up to that point, you even had prison systems that did not rely on state budgets for support. They actually had inmate lease programs where they could get the inmates, force them into labor, and lease that labor to other states and to private organizations to generate funds. As such, you could hire 1 or 2 guards for very cheap, and basically the rest of the ongoings was done by the bigger inmates, those who had the most violent histories, and they basically became little chieftains who ran these various facilities for very cheap. However, in 1976, Estelle versus Gamble is a case that made its way all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, you know how I told you earlier that the higher the court, the more power of what they call stare decisis. What does that mean? That means let the decision stand. The higher the court that is determining something, the more legal force that determination has. Let me bring it into modern times. The Dobbs decision was just rejected by the Supreme Court. What does that mean? Is that trickling down to the entire nation, abortion is a state issue. It is no longer a federally constitutionally protected right. I hope some of this makes sense. The Estelle versus Gamble decision is another decision that made its way to the Supreme Court. What was the issue there? Mr. Gamble, incarcerated in the state of Texas, basically sues the state, stating, you know what, I was an inmate, I was forced to work, a bale of hay fell on my back, and you guys injured my back. Having said that, now you put me in segregation, you're punishing me within the prison system because I'm telling you that I cannot work, and you're forcing me to work anyways. This is a violation of my 8th Amendment right. Hold on a second. What do you mean by that? Well, this is cruel and unusual punishment because I have a medical condition, you're not treating it, and if anything, you're punishing me for it for having this medical condition. Now, the Supreme Court took on the case, and they said, well, Mr. Gamble, there are 2 things here. Number 1, you were seen 17 times in the med clinic at the correctional institution that you were in. 17 times, you know, they might not have been excellent physicians, or they may not have been great nurses, maybe the care you got you didn't like, but they did enough not to violate your 8th Amendment right. They did enough. Well, what does it mean that they did enough? In the language of the Supreme Court was, they were not deliberately indifferent to your serious medical needs. Take a moment to let that sink in. They were not deliberately indifferent to your serious medical needs. Well, what does that mean? That means that any officer, anywhere, if they see an inmate suffering from disease that even a layperson could, recognize this person, needs a doctor and should see someone, then you're not being deliberately indifferent to somebody's serious medical needs. Like in prison these days, whenever a patient comes to me or an inmate tells me, Doc, I was on Klonopin in society, you need to continue this in prison. Well, Mr. So-and-so, this is your 3rd DUI. Klonopin is a habit-forming drug. And actually, no. If anything, I am being very deferential to your concerns. I don't have to give you anything. Not that I would ever say such a thing, but I'm not being deliberately indifferent. I am actually maintaining your constitutional right. I'm listening to what you have to say. It's just that I'm choosing not to treat it. I'm recommending you get therapy or maybe substance abuse groups and what have you. I'm not being deliberately indifferent. You're violating my constitutional rights. No, sir. Please read Estelle versus Gamble. I am not violating your constitutional rights. So, if, and I know I'm belaboring the point, so just bear with me. If I am ever deliberately indifferent to my patient's serious medical needs, then I have violated my patient's constitutional right. I have violated the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. Now, normally when I teach this to medical students at UConn, this is the point at which I like to ask them, did you guys know that you cannot use private or public insurance in the health system of every prison? Estelle basically locked every prison into allocating a proportion of their budget towards inmate medical care. The budget of a prison system is a fraction of what Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance has at their disposal in providing medical care. It's a fraction. It's very small. So in prison, we try to provide medical care, but it really, I mean, the forces of making it as affordable as possible are enormous. This is a reality of what I do. Our formularies are very restricted. I am a master at making use of Haldol and all the old school medications that you sometimes don't even hear about in society, but you know what? They're available in generic, and we make use of them in ways that before this I didn't think was possible. Estelle versus Gamble, 1976, the court decided to intervene, Eighth Amendment violation for a constitutional breach. Can Gamble still sue his physician in a preponderance of the evidence way, saying that, you know what, you committed malpractice when you evaluated my back? The answer is yes. They can still sue in a civil capacity, but they will need to retain their own attorney and what have you. Constitutional guarantees the courts are much more sensitive when an inmate claims that my constitutional rights, Eighth Amendment rights, were violated. If I've lost you guys, please ask me questions. Now, challenge for the audience. An inmate comes in who is a biological male but identifies as a female. Is transgender reassignment surgery a serious medical need? Is that something that the prison budget should be addressing? And I'll just avoid the controversy. That can be very controversial. That can be very, very controversial. You can have expert witnesses who will come and testify that that's not a serious medical need, and you will have others who will come and say, no, that's an actual remedy for gender dysphoria, and the prison system should have to pay for it. I don't know where you guys fall, but I just want to illustrate how complicated this notion can be. What is a serious medical need? Now, when it comes to psychiatric issues, it was not the Supreme Court, but it was the appellate court in the Fourth Circuit, 1977. It's a case of Bowring versus Godwin. Basically, they told Mr. Godwin, listen, we cannot parole you. Why? Because you have mental health issues and you're unstable. And he made a nice argument. And he said, you know what? Based on Estelle versus Gamble, how could you take away my right to parole when you're not providing any psychiatric treatment for me, and then you said that I'm psychiatrically unstable? How could you do that? And basically the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal said, you are right. We cannot make a distinction between physical ills and its psychological or psychiatric counterparts. So that's basically where psychiatric disease is also a constitutional guarantee after Godwin and Bowring. That's what I do. I'm there for their Eighth Amendment rights. I am there in an Estelle capacity to provide treatment for inmates with psychiatric issues. Now, I spent 10 years in the state of Connecticut working in their Department of Corrections. In the state of Connecticut, things are rather interesting because they very much follow case law that came before it. once you're an inmate, especially if you are sentenced, you're a ward of the state. In the state of Pennsylvania, where I've been working since earlier this year, I work on a unit which is civilly committing patients in the greater DOC. Well, Zahidi, what is that? I just want to practice outpatient substance abuse treatment. Just indulge me for a moment. I work on a unit where you have civil liberty rights, like a hospital within the prison system, where you can send the patients through a make-believe ER, and I actually have to commit the patients to my unit within the greater prison system to treat them, to commit them involuntarily, and maybe even treat them involuntarily, which for someone like me who has a bit of a forensic background, I find it fascinating because I have to argue before a judge on every single of my patients that this person deserves to be committed to this unit within the greater prison system. Now, what does that have to do with the case law? If I could just go back, let me go back. You know how in the beginning I said, if you're going to be convicted of a crime and incarcerated, you need to be found beyond a reasonable doubt, 95% sure, that you committed the crime. I get into a fender bender with Joe Podolsky. I have to show with preponderance of the evidence that Joe Podolsky was driving recklessly. Therefore, he owes me money. So what is this clear and convincing evidence? If any of you have ever spent any time on an inpatient hospital setting or at Connecticut Valley Hospital, you will see that the judge will usually opine at the end of testimony, at the end of a case, I find by clear and convincing evidence that this person suffers from psychiatric disease, and is either gravely disabled and poses a risk of harm to themselves. The case of Addington versus Texas, which basically occurred around the same time that Estelle happened, basically Addington sued the state of Texas saying that, you know what, you are detaining me in the hospital with preponderance of the evidence, but I feel detained just like I was like an inmate. It can't be preponderance of the evidence. You have to show, you, Mr. Psychiatrist, have to show beyond a reasonable doubt to take away my civil liberties that I have psychiatric issues that I should be detained. What the Supreme Court of the United States said, you know, we agree on certain aspect and we disagree on a different aspect. Number one, it cannot be beyond a reasonable doubt then because you can't commit anybody to a psychiatric hospital. To be 95% sure that somebody has psychiatric disease and meets criteria to be admitted to a hospital, too many people could not be admitted. Preponderance of the evidence, then the psychiatrist can go crazy. If 51% is all you need for a psychiatrist to say, I think you need treatment. That's a little too loose. So they came up with this standard, clear and convincing evidence, which is, and again, I know the attorneys hate to put a number on it, but that's about 75% sure. And if you go to any commitment hearing, the judge will find by the end of the hearing, I find by clear and convincing evidence. So anytime when I'm at Waymart, which is the old Farview State Hospital, whenever I testify to commit one of my patients to the unit, the hearing officer or the judge finds by clear and convincing evidence, and that's the Addington versus Texas standard. This goes back to the question of Dr. Podolsky. What is the standard for you to admit somebody to a hospital? Another psychiatrist has to be about 75% sure. Now some of you could disagree with me and we can have that discussion later. I have to be 75% sure that the patient before me suffers from psychiatric disease, even if it's substance induced, and two, they pose a risk of harm to themselves or to other people. Now, question. Let's say somebody is admitted via a PEC to an inpatient unit. They are responding to internal stimuli, but are otherwise refusing treatment. Could I go ahead and medicate them against their will? Just because they're admitted to the hospital. Can I go ahead and medicate them against their will? Please speak up if you guys could.
No, you
Good.
cannot.
That's correct. You need to go through, and this comes from the, I believe it's the 12th Amendment. You have to go through what is called due process. Just because they're admitted to the hospital doesn't mean that you can medicate them absent an emergency. Now, when I was in my forensic fellowship, my question was, wait a minute. Why am I, as a psychiatrist, pardon my language, please don't take this the wrong way, why am I quote-unquote babysitting a patient when I can't do anything about it? If the patient is psychotic, what's the point of me admitting them to the hospital? If anything, I've become an arm of law enforcement. I'm just admitting somebody for dangerousness, but I can't do anything about it. And I still don't have a satisfactory answer to that. Hold on, let me see something. Okay, all right, so people are answering in the chat. So I don't have a satisfactory answer to that. In the hospital in the state of Connecticut, and it depends on the kind of hospital you're in. Some hospitals, you have to get an independent psychiatrist to come and opine. And for example, at Connecticut Valley Hospital, you need the judge to actually approve you medicating the patient against their will in that situation. Washington versus Harper, which is the next landmark case. Now, this is a Supreme Court decision. And I find this decision, I'm a bit of a forensic nerd, fascinating. Why? Because in 1990, Harper basically gets incarcerated after he's on probation and he beats up a nurse at a hospital. Well, let's say he was at a Ruth clinic and he becomes aggressive with one of the staff. Assaults the staff, violates probation, gets immediately incarcerated. What's interesting is that once he's in the prison system, there was no commitment in the state of Washington. Hey, you're a ward of the state. You're a ward of the Department of Correction in the state of Washington. He's responding, but he's not quote-unquote tearing up the neighborhood. He's not beating anybody up. He's in his cell and he's responding. Washington set up this system where instead of a court or another psychiatrist, in the context of commitment, 3 people from the staff would simply come and evaluate the patient. It would usually be a psychiatrist, 2 social workers, a psychiatrist, a psychiatric nurse. The 3rd person could even be a correctional officer, not involved in the inmate's care. And well, what does it mean not to be involved? You haven't had anything to do with the chart for the last 30 days. Harper basically said that 3 people can come, the attending psychiatrist presents the case, hello, how are you? And I think about the ethics of this, which is also true in the hospital system. This is my patient. I'm treating him, but I think he's psychiatrically ill, and I think he poses a danger to himself or to society. I mean, ethically, it's really hard to establish trust when that's the testimony you're providing to the court. But that's the nature of the beast. In Washington versus Harper, the attending psychiatrist presents the case, and then those 3 people vote as to whether or not the inmate should be treated against his will. Let that sink in for a moment. That's a huge, huge amount of power for an administrative hearing without any judicial oversight. There's absolutely no judicial oversight. It's an administrative hearing. And what Harper did is Harper sued. Harper said, hold on a second. Hold on. You can't do this. There isn't enough due diligence. There is not enough due diligence. You need to bring me before a court before you can treat me against my will. The state of Washington, for those of you who may or may not know, the state of Washington has been pretty liberal for a long time. They're big on inmate rights. The Supreme Court of the state of Washington, before the case went into the United States Supreme Court, the state of Washington Supreme Court said, yeah, Mr. Harper is correct, that he needs to come before us, and he's entitled to have an attorney represent him, and he's entitled to bring in witnesses, and his attending has to find clear and convincing evidence that, you know what, he would benefit from treatment in the Department of Corrections where he is detained. The Washington Department of Corrections sued all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And I like this story because the Supreme Court of the United States basically slapped down the Washington State Supreme Court, arguing basically the state, Washington DOC doesn't have a budget for this. Their job is to detain people, is not to take people to court. Their resources are limited. Harper is not entitled to this kind of a due process. This quote-unquote administrative hearing is enough. 3 people can come and vote, and yeah, they can decide, and then there are some remedies. It's revisited 4 months from now. Let's say you put him on a decanoate and he's got a bit of a tremor. It's revisited in 4 months. It's not perfect, but this is good enough. This is good enough. Now, regardless of how you feel, in the state of Connecticut, Connecticut follows Washington v. Harper to the T. To the T. And I actually think they did a good job. I think my colleagues do a good job because the psychiatrist has to be in the majority. If you're voting for involuntary treatment, the psychiatrist has to be part of the majority that votes. The one question that I have, and this is an interesting one, I know I may be talking too much, but the 2 criteria that we have for involuntary commitment are dangerousness, which is pretty easily understood. The other criterion is grave disability. The question that I've always posed myself, how could you be gravely disabled in prison? Because by definition, grave disability means you're unable to provide for your food, clothing, and shelter. All of that is provided in prison. How could you ever be found gravely disabled? Which is an interesting question. Think about it. If your food, clothing, and shelter is provided by the environment, how could that be the second criterion that you could be involuntary medicated on? Dr. Zahidi, you've gone way off the deep end. We get that. This is exciting. This is how they do things in Connecticut. How do they do it in Pennsylvania? Again, on my unit, you first have to be committed to my unit. There's a court hearing. Once you're committed to my unit, then I need an independent psychiatrist who comes and opines. The standard there is, would this person, quote unquote, benefit from treatment? That's a very low bar. It's a very low bar. Once I get past the commitment bar of clear and convincing evidence, which is 75%, for a colleague to come and opine, would this person benefit? But, we are pretty critical of each other, us psychiatrists, so you do have some colleagues who don't agree. Well, I don't think the person is dangerous or what have you. It can get a little complicated. Now, the one case that answered a lot of the questions that I had about Harper was Loeffner versus United States. Now, most of you were alive when this happened. This is the case of Jared Loeffner. This was the shooter in Arizona who shot Gabby Gifford in the head. Okay, I don't see too many nods, but this is a case where clearly he has, I don't know if his YouTube channel is still up. Jared Loeffner was sick. I mean, just looking at his YouTube videos, you can tell this kid is psychotic. This kid is psychotic. He went to a political event. He shot Gabby Gifford in the head. Gabby Gifford is actually married to Mark Kelly, who's currently the senator from Arizona. And they are big gun control advocates, and there's a political ramifications from that case. He was arrested as a federal inmate. He killed both he had state victims, but he also had a federal judge that he shot and killed. He was admitted to the federal system in Missouri. The feds have a huge psychiatric unit within their hospital system. I've never been there, but I read about it as part of the case. It was a big, high-profile case, and several arguments came up because Loeffner had an excellent attorney. First of all, Loeffner was not sentenced to anything. He wasn't found guilty of anything just yet. He was just detained for the crime he had committed. He's actively responding. His attorney tried to meet with him. I think he spat on her, and he was destroying the property. So he became subject to what we call a Harper panel in the Department of Corrections. His attorney, the first argument she made was, wait a minute, he's a pre-sentence inmate. He shouldn't be subject to involuntary treatment. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals disagreed. That, you know what, he could be pre-sentence, but he can still be subject to Harper. The next more interesting thing was, for me, Loeffler argued, wait a minute, if I'm going through a Harper panel, I want my attorney present. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, still pretty liberal. They said, no, you're not entitled to an attorney. This is an administrative hearing. This is an administrative hearing. You're not entitled to an attorney. And last but not least, I lost my train of thought there for a little bit. He's not entitled to an attorney. He could be subject to a Harper panel. But you know how in the state of Washington you have 3 members who come and vote? With the feds, their due process is even a little bit looser. They don't have 3 people. It's just the attending psychiatrist petitions. A psychiatrist who's not involved in the case comes and takes a look and says, yeah, I agree with you, go ahead and treat him involuntarily. Or says, no, you know what, let's just watch him a little bit more. It's not 3 people. It's just 1 psychiatrist who's not involved. Dr. Zahidi, how could this be constitutional? Listen, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a judge. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said, you know what, that's good enough. That's good enough. But the one thing I found very interesting in the Loeffler dissent from the Ninth Circuit was, is he really getting adequate due process? I mean, you have one attending psychiatrist applying and another one opining yay or nay, and his patient advocate, who's supposed to be his fighter, his attorney, is she even, or is he even putting up a fight? That's basically where we are in the prison system. So these are the 5 cases that I think are basically not only controlling how we practice psychiatry, how we detain people, how we hold them against their will, but why is it that inmates in the United States are the only subgroup with a constitutional guarantee to have their serious medical needs addressed? What that means, it's still being defined, especially in this day of gender dysphoria, transgender, and other issues. But psychiatry is part of it. So in that regard, psychiatry is always going to be employed when it comes to correctional medicine. Now, this is, oh, good, making good time. Ethical issues that come up in the prison system. And you know, when I walk into a prison system, what am I treating as a correctional psychiatrist? Am I treating to avoid a violation of an inmate's 8th Amendment right? Or am I treating them just like I would treat my private practice patient in the community? That's question number 1. Number 2, are my ethical standards paramount, or what DOC dictates paramount? I can tell you, security, which is the task of the government and the Department of Corrections, security, which includes the orderly running of things, trumps everything. It trumps everything. When it comes to the practice of medicine, security trumps patient autonomy, which is the right to choose. Security trumps confidentiality, which means that, are we subject to HIPAA? They aim to be, but do they really have to be? At the core of it, I would argue no. And it also trumps privacy. You know, could I ask about an inmate's childhood sexual abuse at his cell door where others could hear about it? It's not good practice. But if that's what the logistics of the environment, let's say you're in lockdown, you got to do what you got to do. Security trumps everything. And every Supreme Court decision has recognized that the resources are limited in prison and that you can't just focus on an inmate's rights. The inmate does have rights, but you always have to look at it through the lens of, wait a minute, the government has an interest too. And that interest can step on an inmate's rights. God bless you. I like it when inmates sue because that helps us and that helps the law delineate what rights they have and what they don't have. Now, I'm not encouraging anybody to file lawsuits, but if they feel like their constitutional rights are being violated, they ought to sue. So, going back to the question, the psychiatrist gambit. Who do I serve? Do I serve the 8th Amendment or do I serve my patient? Is the patient paramount? Is the agency that hires me paramount? are the interests of the Department of Corrections or even the law more important than what I do? What I like about prison work is that it's actually a dance. It's a dance. It's an ethical dance that you have to go through every day to determine and try to do the best you can on behalf of your patient. What I can tell you is that most of the case law that I have reviewed, every court expects the physician or the psychiatrist to advocate for the patient. If you sit back and not say anything, if you sit back and observe somebody be subject to inhumane treatment, you may not get anywhere, but you are expected to provide some form of advocacy and to speak up if it's wrong. How do we practice psychiatry in the prison system? It is somewhat belittling because let's say the first inmate gets incarcerated, comes into the prison system. If you're suicidal on an inpatient unit, they put you on one-to-one, but they maintain your dignity. Things are very different in prison. What they do is that they put you in a safety gown, which the inmates colloquially call the turtle suit, which it looks like a toga outfit. And I just think for somebody who's suicidal and in a very depressed state, it's probably not the most uplifting thing to be finding yourself in a safety gown once you get admitted, but it is what it is. The thing is, in prison, and this is what I like about it, you have a lot of organic disease, but you also have a significant degree of personality and characteristic pathology. Yeah, the inmate can be sick, but the inmate can also be not a very nice person. And that's what I like about the psychiatry, because every decision seems to be a bit of a negotiation. And you try to do right by the inmate, but you also have to be practical and try to make it work in there. So that's a little bit of a reflection on the logistics of prison work. Security, orderly running of things trumps everything. But other than that, we are expected to try to maintain as much patient autonomy, maintenance of confidentiality, especially when it comes to the medical record, and privacy. How is it that you're interviewing the patient? Actually, that's it. So that 12:52, that leaves me a little bit of time for questions. I hope I didn't lose you guys too much. I try to distill it down into bits that make sense and hopefully serve a purpose in letting you guys know how is it that when your patient gets incarcerated, what is it that they can expect, what is it that they are entitled to once they come to medicine. I'll just shut up there and see if anybody has questions.
No, well, thank you, Dr. Zahidi. A lot of our patients interface one way or another with the corrections, and I think it's an enigma for a lot of folks, especially for a lot of newer people that may not have had experience with patients or people within that system. So thanks for the overview, but we'll open up to questions. I know we have a lot of people on this meeting from various backgrounds, so I'll let people ask questions. I see Tamika has one, so you can go first.
Hi.
Hi, Dr. Zahidi. My name is Tamika. I am from Prison Love Mindset. I work with the spouses of the incarcerated. And this was very interesting. I learned a lot, so thank you so much. I actually am the wife of a former inmate. And one of the biggest things a lot of people who were, in the position I was in, wonder how can they advocate for the health of their spouse or family member when it feels like you can never get information. It's such a struggle. Like, what legal rights do the family or specifically the spouse have? Is there anything that they can do to at least be an advocate for their loved one?
Well, here's the thing. I can only speak for myself as a psychiatrist. Number one, let me be selfish for a moment. Diagnostically, the more input you have from other parties. I could look at a patient and say, well, I think this is psychosis. I think this is major depression. But I'm a confident enough psychiatrist to know that I don't know everything. Number one, diagnostically, it helps you to get collateral from family and loved ones. That's number one. Number two, in 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 prison, which I would say that's the modern day asylum, especially if the inmate has a psychiatric history, I think you're lucky if the team recognizes that. I think you're lucky if the team recognizes that, you know what, we need to get input from family members. Was this person, because some people can play games in prison. I'm not brushing with a broad stroke. What I'm trying to say is I want to hear from family. What is your support system? What is your support system? Who are you talking to? Because nobody's an island. Nobody's an island. I get very nervous when an inmate tells me, I'm like, is there anybody you can call? Who would you call if I could give you a phone call right now? Who would you call? If they say nobody, I worry a little bit. I worry a little bit because I wonder, you know what, how sick or how compromised is this individual that usually there's a mother who's willing to pick up the phone. That's number two. Number three, I don't advocate. I hope they advocate. They should sue. Some people don't like hearing that, but really, what are their constitutional rights? They need to delineate that at all times. Not only that, the prison system should have a system for folks to be in touch with their loved ones, to get collateral about their loved ones. And what I do know is that when families are not satisfied, in my humble experience, I'm not telling this, I'm happily employed, I had a good time, go to your legislature, go to your state representative and say, listen, I want to hear from so-and-so. I want to know what's going on. I want an update. I want somebody to call me. In my experience, that's how you get somebody to move and get input as to how your loved one is doing. And I would always advocate for family members, get collateral, get an update, see how they're doing. I hope this helps.
I just feel like it's sad that we have to reach out to a state legislator just to get an update on family health.
I know, but I want you to understand the corollary to this. Do you want a medical update? Because if you really think about it, just think about it. What is the primary purpose of incarceration? The government has an interest in containing the individual. Those are the terms of the punishment. Was medical care part of the deal? No, but it's something that they have to do. Who said that? The Supreme Court of the United States said that. But did the Supreme Court also say, hey, DOC, you have got a duty to reach out to family and let them know how they're doing? No. No, we know your budget is limited. We know you guys have a tough time even paying for what you're supposed to do to begin with. We're not going to put that onus on you for DOC and say, listen, this may interfere with safety and security. They have those concerns too. I don't know what their concerns are. Now, again, I'm not an arm of law enforcement, but there is a law enforcement interest in prison to maintain security, to maintain some things quiet and not have it be said. I agree with you. My job is to advocate on behalf of the patient. For those who come before me, I think clinical trumps security a little bit, because if we can get collateral, if we can provide adequate psychiatric care, I actually think that benefits security as well. Less risk of people getting hurt.
So I kind of feel like being able to advocate for your family member who is in prison is just not something that is wanted, I guess.
I'm not. Again, I'm just a psychiatrist. I agree. The reality, the practical aspects of it are it's harsh. It's supposed to be harsh. The question is, what are they supposed to do? And again, the government has security interests, which I can't speak to. That's not what I'm trained to do. But I agree. Yeah, it's very restrictive. I agree.
Yeah, just opening up a conversation.
No, I got you. I hear you, and I got a tiptoe. I hope you understand that too.
Gotcha. Thank you.
No problem. No other questions, huh?
Anything
I have a
else?
question.
Oh, go ahead.
Jennifer Lombardi. I think I've seen your name, Jennifer. You're muted.
Dr. Zahidi, thank you. I work at health and addiction services, women's services. And just wondering, when an individual comes into the system, how are they identified? How do they get presented for a mental health assessment or even a substance use assessment? I mean, I have a friend whose son is incarcerated and has been on a waiting list for methadone maintenance for several months and has not received medication. So just trying to understand the mental health side and the substance use side.
Okay, so just to go back to the lecture, Boring versus Godwin, the mental health side, I like to say this, you know, there's this organization called the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare, and they are establishing standards. A prison doesn't need to abide by them. It does not need to abide by them. However, having said that, since the prison does have a duty to provide, you know, some treatment, everybody who comes in is screened. Everybody who comes in is screened. Now you could ask, well, what kind of screening instrument are they using? That varies by jurisdiction, that varies by the Department of Corrections, but it's best if somebody is screened. And that's how they determine. So that's number one. Anybody who comes in, if they're acting odd, and I like to say that in the Department of Corrections in Connecticut, you have some really good officers who recognize somebody who may be a little bit off. It's not the usual state of mind that they're used to. That's number one. But number two, you know, are they withdrawing? Yeah, you have to treat that because the consequences of that can be severe. Last but not least, if you're talking about methadone, then you're talking about maintenance treatment. Like I said, substance abuse is not a constitutionally guaranteed right. It's not something that, to the best of my knowledge, has been litigated and opined upon. However, this phenomenon of the pervasiveness of opioid addiction and that process of where the inmate leaves prison, ends up doing the same, getting high on the same dose that got him incarcerated, but at this point the receptors are naive, and that's when you get your overdoses. I think it's very reasonable. It's very reasonable for you to consider, you know, medication-assisted treatment, especially, let's say you want to save money, especially around the time of the inmate leaving the prison and if there's an opioid abuse history. Now, why is this friend of yours, why is her son or what have you not getting treatment? I don't know. I know that methadone is new in Connecticut DOC. I can't opine on it. Again, I'm not affiliated with them anymore, but I do know that they're providing the services. I do know. I think it's who has the contract? It's one of the psychiatrists. CHR, you're right. CHR has the contract and they provide for it. I'm not a big fan of methadone. I think if you can get away with buprenorphine or even Suboxone, I think you're better off. But you know what? It's there. God bless them. Let them do it. And I think it's a good idea, especially given this well-recognized, well-documented phenomenon of inmates leaving prison and overdosing on whenever they relapse, because they're doing the same dose that they did when the receptors were used, as opposed to now where the receptors are theoretically much more naive. I didn't answer the question, but because I don't have a good answer.
Thank you. You did. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks. Hi, Dr. Zahidi. Thank you so much for your lecture. We appreciate your time and having us here.
Even if it's a lie, I'll take it. Thank you.
Yeah,
you're a good
absolutely.
guy.
So question, shift on the paradigm of, you know, I look at your statistics on the number of people with serious mental health issues that are currently incarcerated, and it does seem pretty high compared to when we had the state hospitals. Do you see that paradigm shifting to maybe a change in treatment in corrections, or maybe another branch of corrections that focuses mainly on mental health and addiction?
Okay, first question. It comes back to you as the citizen and as the taxpayer. You willing to pay more for that?
Well, I feel like we kind of are anyway, because all the patients that were in the state hospitals are coming through all the clinics now. A lot of them are homeless. You see them nodding their heads in the streets, talking to voices. And we see that a lot here in New London.
I get that. I get that. But are you willing specifically? Because, you know, this is a good question. Are you willing? Because there is stigma. Like I said, it's a double stigma. Once you're incarcerated, there's also the notion that you've committed a crime, that you are of less than moral character.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So the question is the populace willing to increase the budget of the Department of Corrections for them to provide care in there? Now, there are government grants, and I know agencies are applying for these, and there's a recognition that this is what we've done. But personally, if I could just keep it real, I think society is comfortable with this. I think they have always been comfortable because, number one, we as clinicians may not agree that mental illness or severe mental illness is associated with violence, but I think society does. I think in the court of public opinion, that's a fact. That's a fact. So people are much more comfortable knowing that, you know what, this guy, he may be not too well in the head. I feel better that he's in prison. Having said that, I like the idea of that, you know what, we should keep it humane. We should keep it humane. That's the way I look at it. And the answer to your question, there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money going to community treatment. But in prison, things get a little bit murkier because you have the government security interests, which trumps everything. Having said that, New York and other states are recognizing that, you know what, we do have an issue. We do have an issue because good psychiatry equals better security.
So, thank you, doctor. So you would say an increase in psychiatric care within the prison systems is like one solution?
I think first we need to agree that that's a problem. That's where the mentally ill are ending up, or at least regularly end up going there. That's number one. Number two, you know, what is cruel and unusual tends to, you know, the Supreme Court has said, you know, this is it's an evolving standard that changes as society, quote unquote, matures. What are they entitled in there? I'm not here to opine. All I'm saying is correctional psychiatry is a lot of fun. I love what I do. I even like being lied to if there's an antisocial trait in the personality of the patients. But it is a bit of a game, you know. Are we giving too much? Are we giving too little? And I like to keep it realistic. You know, I like to keep it realistic. I'll tell you one thing. You know, nowadays, I treat a lot of patients with depot formulations, Haldol decanoate, Prolixin decanoate. You know, I had read in the textbook that, for example, some of the atypicals have better efficacy if you're dealing with a mood component as well as acute psychosis. For the longest time, I thought this was like a big pharma ploy to do away with the old meds and to add on the atypicals, which are more brand and more expensive. I have categorically changed my mind. Categorically changed my mind. The atypicals are better. Period. Period. I've seen it. I still try to do with the old meds, but the atypicals, I am a convinced man, they are better.
Seems to be better with the side effects too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
I appreciate what you do, Doc.
What?
I appreciate what you do.
No, I appreciate what you guys do.
We just see the frustration day in and day out. You know, we hear the complaints from patients that come out of jail and they say, there's a whole lot of people in there with mental health issues that need other care than being in prison. You know, we hear that.
I know, but this is what I would say. Take this from, now I'm getting personal again. Take this from an immigrant's perspective. You know, I was born in Iran. I like to focus on civil liberties. I do. Who am I to judge if somebody sees Scooby-Doo on the wall whereas there's nothing there? Who am I to say, you know, whether they should do this, they should do that? The truth is, psychiatry, again, this changed in the 1950s. And I wasn't there. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. But psychiatrists did hurt a lot of patients. They hurt a lot of patients to the point that the law had to take over. And when the law took over, basically, I became an arm of police power. If you're dangerous, then it's my job to determine whether there's mental illness and to admit you to the hospital. That's the nature of the beast. I can pretend otherwise, but when it comes to the psychiatry that I practice, is more legal and less medicine. Although in prison there's a lot of medicine. I hope some of this makes sense.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Eliza.
Oh, Dr. P, I just wanted to mention that about this advocacy here in Hartford. They have the Greater Hartford Reentry Council. They do a lot of advocacy. Back in January, they actually had a paid research study for Black women who have a significant other incarcerated. So if you need information, you can contact them with these advocacy questions and anything about, because that's what they're about, making the transition from prison inmates into the community with the resources to help them succeed. So they have everything. They have housing, employment. They are the work, that's their priority. So if anyone they need to contact is the Greater Hartford Reentry Program. That was it.
Oh, that's great stuff. Talal.
Yes, Dr. Zahidi. Just a quick question. Just trying to understand institutional psychiatry further. What does the current healthcare team look like in terms of the healthcare that is provided to inmates or people who may be institutionalized? Is it made up of just psychiatrists, or is it psychiatrists, social workers, and psychologists that
Let
they
me
have
ask you
access to?
this. What do you do, Talal?
I'm in clinical development and medical affairs.
All right. I have to tell you, I don't know how you came up with this question, but that's one of the most fascinating aspects of what I do at this point. And I'm not here to make enemies. I'm not here to step on anybody's toes. But when I worked in the Connecticut Department of Corrections, every service had multiple social workers, licensed clinical social workers on staff. There's usually a clinical psychologist, they call them supervising psychologists, who run the service. There's a psychiatrist and a number of registered nurses as well as LPNs. Now, that was when I was unionized, working for the state, team approach, all sorts of credentials, individuals. Now I'm in Pennsylvania. Now, granted, it's a little bit different. This is a very high impact unit that I work on. Now, in Pennsylvania, I work for, welcome to corporate medicine. I work for a private organization, right? And the credentialing is very different. It's me on the team, and I'm talking about the most severe in the entire Pennsylvania system. It's a 30-bed unit. It's just Zahidi, a unit director who's a social worker, another social worker on the team, a nursing supervisor, 3 nurses, and a bunch of psych techs. There is no psychologist. That's it. This is the team, and it's as efficient as they get. And I'm here to tell you, it's a different ballgame. It is run just like an inpatient psychiatric unit, exquisitely efficient, exquisitely efficient. Stuff happens, you know, and there's the aspect of bedside manners and what have you. I think there's a lot of going to court, involuntary treatment, a lot of collaboration with the Department of Corrections, and that's a dance. I feel like a used car salesman sometimes when I have to work with my counterparts in the Department of Corrections. But they get it, that good psychiatry equals increased safety. They get it. They do get it. So in that regard, On my unit, there are no psychologists. I'm not saying that there's no room for psychologists. The psychologists are on different units, and you need behavioral management plans for this. You need sometimes psychological testing where the diagnosis just baffles everybody. Everybody. The good thing that I have is also an internist who's my counterpart, who's actually quite competent and who gets it, because we also get a lot of zebra medical issues that are unaddressed in our psychiatric patients. So in that regard, the difference in terms of the staffing and how efficient it is in Pennsylvania as opposed to Connecticut, I have to tell you, it's been quite eye-opening for me. It's been very eye-opening for me, and I'm enjoying it. The efficiency is through the roof. I've never seen anything like this. I hope that answers, Talal. I don't know if I did or not.
It did. Thank you.
Is that it? Am I good?
Yeah, anything else from anyone? Otherwise, I gotta say, Dr. Zahidi, it's always a pleasure hearing you talk, and we all appreciate everything you've done. So,
well, thank you for having me, Dr. Podolsky. And if there's my contact information. I like questions. I like challenging stuff. I do work here in Connecticut. I do have my forensic and psychiatric practice, but I'm based mainly in Pennsylvania. This is the knowledge that I have. I hope I made things a little bit clearer for the rest of you guys. And again, thank you for having me, Joe.